Today's shiur begins 13 lines from the top of Daf Mem Hey. On the side of Gemara under the Nosei, the topic heading, we've written that this is a hemshech, a continuation of the topic we were discussing before. Oid be'inyan eved ve'ovid koichovim habo al bas Yisrael uma din havlad. We continue with the topic of a slave or a Gentile that has intimacy with a Jewish woman. What is the din, the status of the child? The Gemara. Rabbi Acho Sar Habira v'Rav Tanchum Brei de Rabbi Chia Ish Kfar Akoi. There are two rabbis here. One, his name is Rav Acho, and part of his title is Sar Habira, and Rav Tanchum from the village of Akko. Poroik Hano Shivuyaisa. Prok is they redeemed captive women. The Osu Me Armoin L'Tiveria. These captive women had come from a place called Armon to Tiveria. Havechado de Abro Me Oived Kechovim. One of them was impregnated by a Gentile. The Osu L'Kamei to Rabbi Ami. Now we have a new marking scheme, the trapezoid or volcano shape, and it's featured on the side under the mivneh, where we've noted Havlotas Shitos L'Tzorach Ma'akav. We're highlighting different opinions in order to be able to keep track of the give and take or the back and forth opinions in the Gemara. So this involves Rabbi Ami. The case came in front of Rabbi Ami concerning a Jewish woman who had been impregnated by a Gentile man. Omar Lahu, and Rabbi Ami said, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Chanina, three great luminaries, the Amri, that they rule. A Gentile or a slave that has intimacy and impregnates a Jewish woman, the offspring is illegitimate, a mamzer. And as we've said in the past, a mamzer is, though considered Jewish, nevertheless he has extreme marital restrictions. He cannot marry someone from the rank and file of the Jewish people. He can marry a mamzeres. In other words, two mamzerim can marry one another. And there are other details to that, but what we want to emphasize now is simply that though the child is Jewish, as the mother is Jewish, however, the offspring is illegitimate. Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, upon hearing this ruling, says, Rabuso lemechshiv Gabri, is it such an accomplishment to rule based on a list of names? If you're basing your ruling on lists of names, I'll give you a counter list, as you'll see now, and a few lines later you'll notice we've dashed underline Havlad Kosher. So this is a counterweight, if you will, in terms of legal decision making. So Rav Yosef says, if you're into Lemechshav Gabri, is to enumerate men in terms of listing luminaries, HaRav Shmuel Bebavel. You have two great Babylonian scholars, Rav and Shmuel, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Bar Kapora Be'eretz Yisrael, and you have these two more luminaries in the land of Israel. V'amri lo Chulufi Bar Kapora V'aili Ziknei Darom. Another version has take out Bar Kapora and in his stead put in the sages of the south, the Ziknei Darom, that they represent the opinion that was said by Bar Kapora. Instead of Bar Kapora Ziknei Darom, but the Amri, they proclaim a slave or a Gentile that has relations and impregnates a Jewish woman, Havlad Kosher. The child assumes the mother's identity exclusively, just like she was a regular Jewish woman, a kosher Jewish woman, so too the Vlad is kosher like the mother. Elo Omar Rav Yosef. We have a little note on the side. There's a star where Rav Yosef says Rav Yosef Omer Rabbi Ami. We're reading the note on the side. Rav Yosef is saying to Rav Ami, De'im atoroitze livsol es havlad b'glas she'shloisha rabbonim elu omru. If your intention is to render the child illegitimate because you have the three rabbis that said what they did, that akum vev rabba bas Yisrael vlad mamzer lo mitnei kach poiskim hochi, not because you have a list of rabbis that you say thusly, elo mishum shezeh dino shel Rebbe, the halacha kamoiso. Rather, it's because Rebbe rules thusly, and Rebbe is a final word in legal decision making. So Rav Yosef is going along the same lines as Rav Ami, as you can see from the house marking, assuming the same shape, the trapezoid shape, assuming the same direction as that of Rav Ami before, but for a different reason. So Rav Ela Omer Rav Yosef, Rebbe he. The ruling that the Vlad is Mamzer is because that's Shitas Rebbe. And we have another marking here, Rav Dimi and Rovin appear in bow ties. You'll see Rovin is in the wide lines, about the 7th wide line later on. And we'll connect these two markings later with the stars that appear at the side of the Gemara text as well. So in the meantime, Dechi also Rav Dimi, Omer of Yitzchok bar Avudimi, Mishum Rabbeinu Omru. In the name of Rabbeinu, it was said that, and note that Rabbeinu is a reference to Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, as Rashi points out. So they said in the name of Rabbeinu, which is Rebbe, Havlad Mamzer, a Gentile or slave that has intimacy and impregnates a Jewish woman, the offspring is illegitimate. We have a bracketed section. In order to appreciate this, take a look at the note on the side where the double star appears. Hesber HaSograyim, the explanation of this bracketed section. It's quite a long bracketed section. You note that with your bracket length indicator. And we've written, Afapi Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Have Retzef Dvorim, Ukemo Shesimanu Es Dvorov, number 2. Even though what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says is an extensive comment, with the bracketed section, we want to show you another continuum. There's a question that Abaye poses after the bracketed section, which is directed to Rav Yosef. Lomahu bochar es girsas Rav Dimi b'divrei Rebbe b'zman sheyesh girsas Rovin shiacheres. We noted Rav Dimi in a bow tie, who presented Rebbe in. We were underlying Rabbeinu, so Rav Dimi presented Rebbe with a particular version, namely the Vlad is a mamzer. So Abaye says why? He says to Rav Yosef, who appeared in the trapezoid. Here, the inverted trapezoid after the brackets. Abaye says to Rav Yosef, why did you present Rebbe's opinion through the eyes of Rav Dimi when there's another version, namely Rovin's version, that comes out different? And Kebosis l'darkenu kan b'sugya ayin Rashi d'ramasel omer le'Abaye. In order to appreciate the markings that we've done here, so you can see Rashi toward the end of the narrow lines, the 4th line from the end of the narrow lines, you see that Rashi takes pains to point out that Omer le'Abaye, to whom is Abaye addressing his comments? L'Rav Yosef. Now by the time you get down to Abaye in the Gemara text without markings, you're a long way away from Rav Yosef. So just to get a feeling of this, we stated Rav Yosef, Rebbe holding as according to Rav Dimi, that the child is a mamzer. Now we skip the bracketed section in the Gemara text. Let's do this together. Omar le Abaye. Abaye says to Rav Yosef, my chozis de samchis ad Rav Dimi. What is it that you saw fit to rely on Rav Dimi, who and his girsa of Rebbe, smoch ad Rovin? Why not rely on Rovin's approach? The also Rovin Omar, Rabbi Yonasan Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Moirim Ba Lehetera. Rav Yonasan and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, they rule leniently. Uman Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe. So that you see that their lenient ruling means that they're ruling that the Vlad, that the offspring is kosher. So so as we said, Abaye is making a point there that is addressed directly to Rav Yosef with an opposite conclusion. So that here we saw Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi are Morim Bolatera and Uman Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi Rebbe. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rebbe are one in the same personality. Let's now go back to the bracketed section that we skipped, having demonstrated the superstructure of our sugya. The last point that we saw, where there was a little diamond number 1, namely the ruling given in the name of Rebbe, that the child that resulted from a Gentile or slave impregnating a Jewish woman, the Vlad is mamzer. Rabbi Shimon Levi Omer Avlad Mekulkol. Word Mekulkol means messed up or ruined. Leman, when you say it's ruined, ruined for whom? Ilemo lakahol. If you're trying to say that the child is unacceptable to marry into the Jewish people, Ha'omar Rabbi Yeshua, but Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi has been known to say Havlad kosher. And Rashi points out that this was stated by Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi before that the Vlad is kosher. If you use the arrows to the immediate left-hand side of the Gemara text to navigate, you will see, just align this arrow with the arrow before, and you see we read that before. We have a little number 3 above, where Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was one of the 4 opinions that Rav Yosef has cited that the Vlad is kosher. Kosher meaning to marry into the Jewish people. So when Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi here describes that very same child as Mekukol, we continue in the Gemara, Elo likahuna, that if it's a girl that's born from that union, the girl cannot marry a Kohen. The Kulu, Amoroi, the Machshiri, all the Amoraic opinions that allow the child to marry into the Jewish community, Modu, Shavlad, Pogum, Lukuna. They concede that the offspring is unfit to marry into the Kuna, Mikal V'chomer Me Almona, based on Kal V'chomer logic, using as the starting point the case of the Almona who marries a Kohen Gadol. Now the house marking is indicated on the side as Litzorech Ma'akav, a device used to keep track of the back and forth reasoning in the Gemara. So what is the logic? The Kal V'chomer Me'almona. Ma'almona l'kohen gadol she'ini surah shava b'koil b'no pogum. We know that a Kohen Gadol has restrictions upon whom he can marry, and he is not allowed to marry, amongst others, a widow. And let's say he does impregnate. He marries a widow, impregnates her. This is an isur that's not shave b'koil. It's not applicable in a unified fashion across the boards. It's limited to the Kohen Gadol. And yet, even though it's such a minor type offense in the sense that it's limited to a Kohen Gadol, and yet, b'no pogum, the child is unfit to marry into the kahuna. Zu, the oved kechavim she'isura shove b'koil, Gentile marrying Jewish woman is a equally across the boards applied prohibition. Eino din shivana pogum, all the more so the child will be rendered unfit to the kuna. Gemara says, but you can't use that reasoning. This is a pircha, this is an undoing of that logic. If your starting point was almona, trying to show that it's a lesser type offense and yet the child is pogum, not so. Ma le'almona l'kohen gadol sheken hi atzma mischaleles. The almona has a stringency that you don't find by other violations, and that is that not only is the Vlad pogum, but she also is ruined. So that, let's say, that extra feature is responsible for the child being considered unfit to the kahuna. The Gemara says back, if that is what you think is special to almona l'kohen gadol, that's not true. Hacha nami kivan shenivala pasla. A kosher Jewish woman that had relations with a Gentile, that itself ruins her for the kahuna. Diam Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon minayin loive kichavim ve'evet habo al hakohenes v'alavia v'yisraelis. From where do we know that a Gentile man that has intimacy with any type of Jewish woman, whether she's a kohenes, she's from a Kohen family or from a Levi family or from a standard Jewish family, shepasluha, that she is rendered unfit henceforth to marry a Kohen. Shenemar, the pasuk says, Ubas Kohen Kisia Almona Ugrusha. The pasuk refers to a Bas Kohen when she becomes a widow or a divorcee. So the pasuk describes her as going back to her father's house and participating and partaking of truma, of things that Kohanim are entitled to. She's the daughter of a Kohen, and her daughter or her Kohen status is not affected, even though she became a widow or divorced. And we now learn from this pasuk, Mi sheyeshlo almonus v'gerushin ba. If her widowhood or her divorcee status comes from someone that is capable of rendering her thusly, then she retains her Kohen or kosher status. Yotzu oived kechavim ve'eved she'ein lohem almonus v'gerushin ba, to the exclusion of those kinds of people, Gentiles and slaves, that don't create the status of almona. An almona is a woman that had been wedded, but there's no matrimonial bond that's formed in the first place with an eved or oived kechavim. So that if they have relations with her, a slave or a Gentile, so they don't conform to the rules of the pasuk, so she loses her, we'll say, her Kohen status. And albeit if it's a function of divorce, so in the case of a Jewish man divorcing the Bas Kohen, that will render her unfit to the kuna on the grounds of being a divorcee. But if she becomes widowed, that wouldn't render her unfit. However, in the case of a woman who had relations, had intimacy with an Eved or Ovid Kechavim, in either way, she, by virtue of the relations themselves, she becomes unfit to the kahuna. So she, the Jewish woman, is no different than the case of the Almona, the Kohen Gadol, in that sense that she now has become unfit or disqualified to the kahuna. So if the last house marking is in the upward position where the point is facing up, so you can see that the logic that was said before still applies. The Kal V'chomer for Almona, and the result of that is that the child is rendered unfit to the kahuna. Omar Le Abaye. Abaye goes back to Rav Yosef. He addresses Rav Yosef, who had concluded that the reason for rendering the Vlad Posel in the case of the Oived Yechav Ve'eved Haba Bas Yisrael was based on the fact that Rebbe ruled thusly. Omar Le Abaye says to Rav Yosef, "My chosis to Samfus ad Rav Dimi. What is it that you see fit to rely?" The Samfus means to rely on Rav Dimi's version of Rebbe. Smoch ad Ravin. Why not rely on Ravin's version of Rebbe? Dechi also Ravin Omar. When Ravin came, he told us. And before we go further, just note the triangles that appear, and on the side under the Mivneh heading, the triangles represent Moire Bo Lehetero, Deil Sheposku Begoy Habo Al Bas Yisrael Avlad Kosher. All of these triangles highlight opinions that hold that a Gentile that has relations with a Jewish woman, the child is kosher. Don't make any mistake about it. This is an unfounded and illicit type of relationship. But as far as status of offspring is concerned, the child is nonetheless kosher. Male, Gentile, with Jewish female. So Ravin says that Rabbi Nosson, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, Moirim Bo Lehetera. They rule, Morim is to rule, they rule in a permitted fashion, meaning that the child is kosher. Uman Rabbi Yehuda Anasi. Who is this Rabbi Yehuda Anasi that we dashed underline? Rebbe. It's Rebbe. And here you contrast this with Rav Dimi's version of Rebbe, where the Vlad, according to Rav Dimi's version of Rebbe, was Mamzer. Here, Ravin's version of Rebbe is Vlad is kosher. The Af, and note that we have a long point marking. The Af Rav Moire Bo Hetera. Rav also says that the Vlad is kosher. Dahu the also the Kamei the Rav. was a case of a child who had been the product of a Gentile having impregnated a Jewish woman, his mother. Omar Lei, the person asked, a Gentile that has intimacy with a Jewish woman, what is the status of the child? Omar Lahu Vlad kosher. So Rav said the Vlad is kosher. And in other words, Rav is saying to this fellow, you are kosher. Omar Lei, so the questioner asks, Havli Bartech, so let me marry your daughter. Rav says, Lo Yahivna Loch, I'm not giving you my daughter in marriage. Omar Simi Barchio LeRav. So Simi Barchio was an onlooker, witnessed this event, said to Rav, Amri Inshi, people will say, Gamlo b'modai akavo rakta. This is a common saying. People say that a camel in Modai dances on a kav. A kav is a type of measuring device, like a bowl or that measures a certain amount. In this case, it's a kav. So, continuing in just a common saying, Rav Simi Barchio says, well, ha kava, v'ha gamla, v'ha modai. Here all the ingredients are in place. You've got the kav and the camel and modai, v'lo rakta, and there's no dancing. In other words, you're saying to this child, this gentleman, that you are kosher, and yet at the same time, you're not giving your daughter over to her. If you look in Rashi, underneath the Gemara text, at the end of the line, the first line of Rashi, ha kava, ha gamla, for Modai, Yavo Viraked, let it come and dance Lefoneo in front of us. Klomar, Atoshi Tarto, the Var Chidush, you who were matirs, a novel point, Ha'ames Devorecha, prove your words, V'tein lo bitcha, and give him your daughter. Let's continue in the Gemara. Omar Lei, so Rav says, I have Yoshua ben Nun lo yahivno le barti. If he would be like Yoshua ben Nun, I wouldn't give him my daughter. Omar le, so Simi says back, I have Yoshua ben Nun. If he was like Yoshua ben Nun, imar lo yohiv le achrini yavi le. If you don't give your daughter to him, someone else will. There'll be only too honored to give their daughter to the likes of Yoshua ben Nun, the great Yoshua, the successor of Moshe Rabbeinu. Hi, but in this case, you, imor lo yohiv le, if you don't give your daughter to this man, who is not like Yoshua ben Nun, achrini lo yavi le, no one else will give their daughter to him either. Lo have ka'azul mikame. This gentleman was recalcitrant. He was not budging. He was insisting on getting Rav's daughter in marriage. Yohiv bei einei v'shachiv. Rav gave him the rabbinic look. That's Yohiv bei einei. He glared upon him and he died. V'af Rav Matana moira ba lehetera. Rav Matana likewise ruled that an eved or ovi korovan ba b'Yis Yisrael, the child is kosher. V'af Rav Yehuda moira ba lehetera. Rav Yehuda as well ruled thusly. The chi also lekamed Rav Yehuda. When a case like that, when a fellow came who was a product of a Gentile impregnating the Jewish woman, his mother, the case like this would come to Rav Yehuda, Omar Lei. So Rav Yehuda would say, and we're talking in the context of his trying to get married, his wanting to get married, Rav Yehuda would say to him, Zil Itmar, go and hide. Means go to a place where they don't know who you are, they don't know your background, and marry a Jewish girl over there. Because if they would know your background, they won't want to give you their daughter. So you see from the fact that he's giving this counsel, it shows that he is allowed, that Rav Yehuda wouldn't give a piece of advice that would lead to a prohibition. That in principle, a Jewish girl is allowed to marry him. It's just that people are a bit reticent, but it's okay. Therefore, you see, he's not a mamzer. Now, we go back to the Gemara text. Rav Yehuda is telling this child the union of a goy, of a Gentile impregnated Jewish woman, go Hide, meaning go to a place that they don't know who you are. Oy, nosif bas minach, or find a girl that has the same background as you have. V'chi also l'kamei de Rava, when a case like this would come to Rava, Omar lei, Rava would say, Oy goli, o nosif bas minach. Goli means go into exile, meaning once again a place that they don't know you, they don't know your background, and they'll give you a Jewish girl over there, or marry a girl that has the same background as you do. What we would refer to a Gentile father and Jewish mother. And when we say father, bear in mind we're referring only in biological terms, but in halachic terms, he's not connected, he's considered a full-fledged Jew, and hence not connected to his Gentile father. Before we continue, we have a topic heading on the side, because as you can see, we have a slash mark indicating that which follows is a new trend of thought. So on the side, we have the nosei, mi shechetzio eved, chetzio ben chorin, someone who was part eved and part slave. Now that situation can arise where a slave was owned by two people, and one of the owners freed his half of the slave, making him a ben chorin. The other half remains owned by the other owner. A ben chorin is a Jew. When we see the term ben chorin, we are saying he is Jewish. So he's half Jewish and half slave. Someone like that, it impregnates Habo Abbas Yisrael Mahu. If he has relations and impregnates a Jewish girl, what is the outcome? The Gemara. Sholchu le b'nei Bei Michsi le Rabba. The people of Bei Michsi, it's the name of a place, they sent to Rabba, Mi shechetzio eved v'chetzio ben chorin, Habo Abbas Yisrael Mahu. Someone who is a half slave, half free person, that impregnates, that has relations with a Jewish girl, what is the din? Omar lei, Rabba responds, Hashto eved kulo amrinon kosher, a full-fledged slave that would have relations with a Jewish girl, we say the offspring is kosher. So chetzio mibaya, someone who is only half slave, do you need to think about that even? In other words, certainly the vlad is kosher. Omar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef raises a question. Note the long question marking till the third line from the top of Omed Beis. Rav Yosef says, he says to Rabbah, Mora dishmaitza monu. Now, if you look at Rashi at the bottom line, Mora dishmaitza de Omar, who is the one that said, Oived kichavim ve'eved abo Abbas Yisrael b'no kosher? Who is the one that has said that point? The Gemara here at the top of Omed Beis continues, it's Manu, Rebbe Yehuda. It is Rebbe Yehuda. And we have a marking there on the side of the Gemara text, a double star. You can see where that connects to 4 lines from the bottom of Omed Aleph. It's Rebbe Yehuda. He said that point that the vlad is kosher. Amar Rebbe Yehuda. But that same Rebbe Yehuda has been known to say, Mishechetzi eved v'chetzi ben chorin, Habo Abbas Yisrael, Oisei vlad ein lo takona. That in the case of the half-slave, half-free man that impregnates a Jewish woman, the child has no solution. Now, by saying no solution, as Rashi points out, it's basically saying that it's a mamzer. So, how do we resolve this seeming discrepancy in the opinion of Rav Yehuda? Ki itmar de Rav Yehuda. The Gemara attempts to resolve this. Note the number 1. That indicates that later on there's going to be another approach to what we're saying now. That will be indicated by the number 2 written between the lines later on. So, the Gemara says, when is it that Rav Yehuda said that the vlad is a mamzer? Kegoin, the Kodesh Bas Yisrael. Now we squiggle underline the word Kodesh, a very significant word over here. The case where the half-slave, half-free man creates a mamzer through his union with a Jewish woman That is only under the circumstances that he married her. He offered her money in betrothing her. Not a simple act of intimacy in a, we call it a znus, one night stand fashion, but rather he married her. The nimsa tzad abdus shaboy mishtamesh be'eshes ish. The result of this is that the side of him that's a slave is having relations with a married woman. The married woman's effect comes as a result of the free half of him marrying her. So intimacy with a married woman, a woman married to someone else, or in this case another entity, that will result in mamzerus. However, one night stand, some fling that a half Eved, half free man has with a Jewish woman, that means without kiddushin, the child is kosher. On the side of the, and that is in Rashi, fourth line from the top, Kegon de Kodesh, Misha Chetzu Eved B'Chetzu Ben Chorin is Bas Yisrael, we'll call him the half. He married a Jewish woman, and then had intimacy with her. The Kevan de Kodsha, since a marital bond was formed, Havia Mikudeshes Litzad Cherus, she's considered married to the half of him that's free. Avolo Litzad Avdus, but not to the enslaved half. The result of that would be that the half of him that is enslaved is having intimacy with a married woman. Ulafiko Havlad Mamzer. The Chol Hani the Michshri B'Pnuyah Michshri. In all the cases, in all the triangles that we had before, where we saw kosher, we saw the Vlad was kosher, we're dealing with an unmarried woman, a Pnuyah. Avol B'Eishes Ish, but when you're dealing with a Jewish woman that is married, Afilu B'Yisrael, even if it's a Jew that has intimacy with her, and it's not his wife, Havlad, Mamzer V'Kol Shekein Oived Kechavim Be'eved. The child will be illegitimate, and all the more so if you're dealing with a Gentile or slave. Avol Hecho Debo Oleo Below Kiddushin Kosher. But where the intimacy is with an unwedded, an unmarried Jewish girl or Jewish woman, the child is kosher. And now we continue with a long question. And this long question then will result in a second approach to explaining Rabbi Yehuda. V'ho'amri nahardoi mishmei de Rabbi Yankiv. Has it not been said in the name of Rabbi Yankiv, l'divrei ha'poisel, poisel afilu b'fnuya. According to those who consider the child mamzer, unfit, then that is true even if the woman is a pnuya, is unmarried. L'divrei ha'machshir, machshir afilu b'eishes ish. Notice the dashed underlining. Those who are machshir, who say that the vlad is unaffected, they'll say thusly, even if the slave or the goy has relations with a married woman. Now, we have a little note on the side where we've written Mikan Royim. From here we see Benigud l'tshuva shesh l'chalik bein hecha dekodesh lehecha debo al olel biznus. That in contrast to the answer we gave before to distinguish between a case where he married her or had just a fling with her, kan roim she'ein af echad shemachalik. Here, no opinion makes that distinction. In other words, we just saw in our Gemara Aleph and Beis, one opinion says that an Eved Kechavim or Eved that has relations with a Jewish woman, the child is unfit even if the Jewish woman is a single girl. And that means under all circumstances the kid is unfit. And according to the opinion that says the child is kosher, under all circumstances the child is kosher, namely even if she is a married woman. Ushnehem, the Gemara continues, Ushnehem lo lomdu elo me'eshes av. Both of these opinions, the Aleph and Beis, learn from the Eshes Av precedent. An Eshes Av is a person's father's wife. It's not his mother, but it's his father's wife. And in the Torah, so of course having relations with a father's wife is a strictly prohibited relationship, and in that context the Torah speaks about mamzerus. So we use Eishes Av as a precedent for understanding mamzerus. Man de posil, he who renders the child unfit, Savar, holds as follows: Ma Eishes Av, the lo tapsi bo kiddushin havlad mamzer. Just like if a person tries to create a marital bond between himself and his father's wife, there is no tfisas kiddushin. It doesn't take hold. It doesn't materialize. And we know that the child there is a mamzer. Av kol de lo tapsi bo kiddushin havlad mamzer. So to any relationship where there could not be a materializing of a matrimonial status, relationship with such a woman, man-woman relationship will result in a mamzer. Uman de machshir savar, the opinion that holds that the child is kosher even in the case of an eved or a bas Yisrael that's married, holds, again, learning from Eishes Av. That's the precedent. Ma Eishes Av, the L'didei lo tapsi bo kiddushin lachrini tapsi bo kiddushin. One's father's wife, assuming that the father is dead or divorced, that lady, though to you it's your father's wife, though to you she's forbidden, but she could be married by any other Jew. She's eligible for marriage, where a marital bond will form with someone else, maybe not with you, but with anyone else. So someone like that, someone that has those characteristics, where we can say, L'didei lo tapsi bo kiddushin lachrini tapsi bo kiddushin, la'afuke, to the exclusion of. Before we go further, the Eishes Av then represents the type of relationship that would cause mamzerus. La'afuke, to the exclusion of oved techovim ve'eved, the lo tafsi behu kiddushin klal. The Gentile or the slave does not result in materialized matrimony ever. In other words, the concept of a marital bond through kiddushin doesn't exist between any Jew and a Gentile or slave. Elo ki itmar de Rav Yehuda, the explanation of Rav Yehuda before, we have to resolve how is it that Rav Yehuda can say that on the one hand the Oivik Rama Baal Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is kosher, and in the case of the Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin that has relations with the Bas Yisrael, you tell me that the Vlad is a mamzer. How do we resolve that? So Elokiyat Mad Rav Yehuda, when did Rav Yehuda say that the Vlad is a mamzer? Kagon Shebo al Eishes Ish, the Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin had relations with a married woman. Notice the dashed underlining and contrast this with the dashed underlining above. Above we emphasized the slave half of him. Here we're emphasizing the free side of him. So a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin had a fling with a married woman, and notice another marking. We squiggle underline Shebo al Eishes Ish. Above, we squiggle underline the fourth line from the top, the Kaddish. Again, point of contrast. Shebo indicates a fling, a one-night stand, as opposed to formal marriage. So when you have this situation of a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin having a one-night stand with a Jewish married woman, married to someone else, v'nimtza tzad cherus shebo mishtamish be'eishes ish, the free half of him, which is the Jewish half of him, is having intimacy with a married woman. And of course, that would result in mamzerus. However, if it's a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin having relations with an unwed, single Jewish woman, then the Vlad would be kosher. Omar Ravina. Before we continue, we glance at the side. We have a topic heading. Under the nosei, we have written, Din Havlad, the ruling the status of the child, the Mikra Shel Eved Oy Akum Habal Bas Yisrael. 1. Penuya. 2. Eishes Ish. We're continuing then the theme that we've been dealing with till now of the half slave, half free man having relations with a single Jewish woman or a married Jewish woman. So Rabina, Omar Li Rav Gaza. Rav Gaza told the story, the following. Iklo Rav Yossi Ba'ovin La'asrin. Rav Yossi came to our town. V'have uvda b'fnuya v'achshir. There was an incident with a full-fledged slave that had relations with a single Jewish woman, and he rendered the child kosher. Be'eshesish uposil. A case of a slave having relations with a married Jewish woman, and he rendered the child unfit, a mamzer. Omar Rav Sheshes. Now you'll notice that we have a little bays. This is in contrast to the aleph that we had above Ravina. Bays. Rav Sheshes says, Lidi Omar Li Rav Gaza. Rav Gaza told me, Lo Rav Yossi Bar Oven Have, Elo Rav Yossi Bar Zavida Have. First of all, by way of names, the Rav Gaza story, according to Rav Sheshes, is different. It wasn't Rav Yossi Bar Oven, but rather it involves Rav Yossi Bar Zvida. And that's why we have this dashed underlining, so you can contrast this with the dash underlining 3 lines above. And furthermore, for further contrast, the Akshir, Bain B'fnuyo, Bain Be'eshesish. Notice the dot underlining. Pay close attention to the way we've marked this. We've dot underlined Akshir, not only by a single woman, but also if she is married. Above, we dot underlined the Eishesishu Posil, again a point of contrast. He's Machshir, the case of the Eved, the full-fledged slave that had relations with a married Jewish woman. The child will be considered kosher. Omerle Rav Acha Brei de Rava le Ravina. Iklo Ameimar la'asrin. Ameimar came to our town. The Achshir bein b'fnuyo bein be'eshes ish. Now notice the numbering here. This is number 2, following the number 1, just 2 lines above. In other words, they're saying the same thing. They're following in the same trend of thought. The Hilchasa, the Gemara now rules, Oivei kechavim ve'eved habo albas Yisrael. A Gentile or slave that has relations with a Jewish woman, havlad kosher. The child is acceptable, bein b'fnuya, bein be'eshes ish, whether she's a single Jewish woman or even if she happens to be married to a Jewish man, a married Jewish woman. So in contrast to a Jewish man having intimacy with a married woman, married Jewish woman, there it's clear that the child is a mamzer. Not so, you might say ironically, but not so if it's a goy or an eved that has relations with the married Jewish woman. Rava Achrei l'Rav Mori bar Rochel. Rava ruled as kosher this gentleman, Rav Mori bar Rochel, umanye, and appointed him b'Pursi de Bovel. Pursi is an office. As an officer, he is appointed over Jewish people, so it's a position of authority. And he appointed him to this position in Bovel. And just a word about Rav Mori bar Rochel. Rochel was the daughter of Shmuel, and she had become impregnated by a goy. So that it's a case of a Oivei kechavim habo albas Yisrael. Rava says that even though that's his background, that his father was a Gentile, that is not reason enough to prevent his being appointed to a position of authority. And the Gemara explains, the Afagav, the Omar Mar, even though it has been said, based on the Pasuk, Soim Tosim Olecho Melech, Nikerev Achecha, the Pasuk says that you shall appoint a king, and a king is representative of a position of authority. You are not to appoint someone to a position of authority unless he's from amongst your own kind. Nikerev Achecha. And we learn from this, Kol Masima Shata Mesim, all positions that you appoint, Al Yehu Elo Mikerev Achecha, shall not be other than from amongst your midst. Therefore, a standard convert, someone who was a full-fledged Gentile who converted to Judaism, even though he is highly regarded in the eyes of the law and the eyes of the Torah, nevertheless, he is not to be appointed to a position of authority. In the case of Rav Mori Bar Rochel, came from the Imoy Israel, since his mother was Jewish, Mikerev Achecha Karinon Bey. That is sufficient to categorize him as from amongst your brethren. On the side, we have a topic heading, Tevilas Isha Akum, the immersion of a Gentile woman, L'Shem Nida, where she immerses herself with the intention of purification after her menstrual period. V'gever Akum, L'Shem Keri, or a Gentile man who immerses himself in a mikveh to purify himself from Keri. Keri is Tuma, that is a characteristic of men that have a semen release. Nechshav Tvila L'Shem Gerus. We're going to see a very interesting idea here that their immersion is considered the equivalent of an immersion for conversion purposes. Now, for conversion purposes, part of the conversion process involves immersing in a mikveh, a ritual bath. With regard to men, we see that there is need for circumcision as well. Now, as far as the details, how much is really necessary, what's binding and what's not, this will be the subject of the sugya as it unfolds. In this case, we're going to be seeing immersions by these Gentiles, but they have intention to accomplish through their immersion something that's of a uniquely Jewish nature. In the case of the woman, purification from Nidah status, and in the man, purification from Keri status. Now the Gemara. Avdei de Rabbi Chia bar Ami at bela lahi oivedes koichavim l'shem intisa. The servant of Rav Chia had a Gentile woman immerse with the intention. L'shem intisa literally means for the sake of womanhood, but it means for the sake of purification from nidah, and not for the purpose of conversion. Omar Rav Yosef, Yachilno lachshuri ba ubabarta. I could render her and her daughter as kosher. Ba, kid Rav Asi, based on Rav Asi's teaching, the Omar Rav Asi, mi lo tavla lenidusa. Rav Asi looks at this as a type of immersion with conversion powers to it, because we say, did she not in fact immerse for nidu's purposes, and that itself shows a conversion intent, because that's something only Jewish women do. So if she was immersing for purification from nidus, that's the equivalent of immersing for something of a Jewish nature, and that's considered conversion. Bebarta, Rav Yosef says, I can mashir the offspring. In this case, we have a slave having relations with this woman after her immersion, producing a daughter. A Gentile or a slave that impregnates a Jewish woman, the child is kosher. So either way, after this servant, this slave of Reb Chia, immersed the Gentile woman with nidah purification in mind, so that accomplishes her becoming Jewish, and the daughter that results from such a union, such an impregnation, would also be kosher. Hahu dehavu correlate bar amyaisa. We have a new marking here, so the note on the side of the Mivneh indicates Shnei Maisim Domim, two similar incidents. So there was an incident that he was called Bar Amyaisa, son of Gentile woman. In other words, the people were claiming that his mother had not immersed in a ritual bath, in a mikveh, for conversion purposes. Amar Ravasi, upon hearing this description of the fellow, said, Milo Tovlo Nidusa, did she not in fact immerse herself for Nida purification? And that's enough. So that his mother is Jewish as far as we are concerned. Hahu dahavu correlate bar amo. There were those that called so and so the son of a Gentile man. Omar Rabbi Shimon Levi says, if that's what you're calling him, you're making a mistake. Milo toval l'kiryo. Didn't that man, this fellow's father, didn't he immerse himself for keri purification? And that too is a sign of Jewishness, making the father a Jew. We have to point out something that we have mentioned many times for those of you who are veterans of Gemara markings, that as we learn a Daf Gemara, we in no way intend for anyone to reach practical halachic conclusions. And especially in this sugya of gerus, which is a very sensitive topic, a very timely topic, one should understand that the Gemara presents a variety of opinions. I hope that became clear in today's shiur. And therefore any one opinion that you see cannot be assumed to be the final halachic ruling until you actually learn the halachic sources themselves. And the Gemara is simply the basis of that, but not the final word. Before we continue in the Gemara, we glance at the side. We have a topic heading where we have written Halokech Eved Mino Akum. Someone who purchases a slave from a Gentile. V'kidam oise Eved v'tova l'shem ben chorin. And that slave, before you started enslaving him, before you started working with him, he jumped into a mikveh and was tovel with intention of conversion. Kona atzmo ben chorin. That is effective in enabling him to become a free man. So even though you may have paid money to the Gentile for his slave, you are not at the end of the day going to be benefiting from a slave, because he in the meantime converted for immersed himself for conversion purposes. Now the Gemara. Omar Rav Chamo bar Gurya. Omar Rav. Halokeach Eved min ha'oivei kechovin. Someone who purchased a slave from a Gentile. V'kidam v'toval l'shem ben chorin. And he hastened and immersed himself with conversion intent. L'shem ben chorin means for becoming a free man. And free man in this context, in Gemara, in Halacha, when you see the term ben chorin, it means with conversion to Judaism purposes. Kona atzmo ben chorin. This is an effective form of immersion, and becomes a free man. My taima. Why is this? The Gemara continues at the top of Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Oivei kechavim gufa lo konile. The original owner was an oivei kechavim. He, though he owns the slave, he owns him only with respect to his work obligation. He doesn't own him inherently. The word gufa is a word that I find a little hard to translate, but it has to do with a higher level of ownership. That's why I use the term, he doesn't own him inherently. He owns him on a monetary level. And we say that my dekonile hu de maknile l'Yisrael. You can't sell to someone any more than you own. So what aspect of the slave did the original Gentile owner sell to the Jew? He sold what he owned in him. So that which he owned, my dekonile, that which he owned in him, he transferred to him. V'kevon the kidam v'tova l'shem ben chorin, and since he hastened to immerse himself for the sake of conversion, af ga'ayin l'shibudei, that that releases the slave, that releases the monetary obligation. The shibud. Shibud is a term that indicates monetary, being bound monetarily or being bound financially. So his immersion in the mikveh, his gerus, undoes whatever financial obligation, work obligation that this slave may have had to the Jew. Kidda Rava, based on Rava's principle, or Rava's teaching, Diyama Rava, hektish chometz v'shichur mafkiin midei shibud. Sanctification, if, let us say, an item was set up as a type of collateral, meaning that if the creditor doesn't pay from cash, so he set up his slave or his animal to be the source of collection. And then he, after setting up the lien on that item, he then sanctifies it. If he does that, then we said before, the creditor here means here in this case we should be more accurate and say the creditor who, when he seeks to collect the debt from the person who owed the money, will not be able to collect from that item anymore, because the hektish, the sanctification, is mafkia. It undoes the lien. Likewise, chometz, upon the onset of Pesach, if someone had a lien on chometz, it undoes that. It's no longer bound. Rashi explains, if someone had set up his chometz as a source of debt collection to a goy, and it's in the possession of the Jew, and then the Erev Pesach sets in, the Oved Kovim doesn't collect from that anymore, because it's not considered the debtor's chometz because of the prohibition of chometz. He has to destroy it. But more pertinent for our discussion is shichur, as we just described, where the fellow had an obligation to work as a slave, but his shichur, his immersion in the mikveh, his setting free, undoes that. So with that in mind, we understand Rav Chama Bar Guya's ruling that was said in the name of Rav, that if a person buys a slave from a Gentile, and the slave is, let's say, quick-witted, and before possession is taken by the Jewish owner, he jumps into a mikveh, that will undo any obligation, any further obligation that he would have as a slave, because he is no longer that. As a result of the shichur, the freeing, and in this case the freeing is the immersion in the mikvah, undoes any further obligations. The sugya itself continues, but we will be pausing at this point. Next time we pick up with a question on that which we've just said. But this is a convenient pausing point in the context of the Daf Yomi.